Milan in autumn had a certain charm. The golden leaves danced along the cobbled pavements of Via Brera as art students bustled between cafes and galleries. Brera Academy, one of the city's most prestigious art schools, stood quietly proud, its stone facade worn by centuries, but still magnificent. Giulia Santoro was late. Again. Her long dark curls bounced as she sprinted through the academy's arched entrance, sketchbook clutched to her chest. A recent transfer from Florence, Giulia was still finding her feet in the brisk, stylish world of Milanese academia. Today was important. Professor Marino was unveiling the semester's final group project. Whispers echoed through the marble corridors about the student he had paired her with, Edoardo Bellini. Edoardo was infamous, tall, charming, with sharp cheekbones and a sharper tongue. His artwork was brilliant, surreal and haunting, but his reputation? Chaotic. Rumor had it he once filled the studio with live pigeons as an interactive installation. No one had dared partner with him since. As Giulia slid into her seat, breathless and flustered, Edoardo glanced over. His smirk was unreadable. "You're the new one, right? We're together now," he said, voice smooth and lazy. Professor Marino began outlining the rules of the project, but Giulia barely heard them. Her gut churned, not with excitement, but apprehension. Edoardo turned to her once more and added under his breath, "Let's make something unforgettable." It wasn't a suggestion. From that moment, something shifted in the air. Whatever this project would become, Giulia felt it wouldn't be safe, or ordinary, and certainly not legal. 2 days later, Giulia met Edoardo in a dim, paint-stained studio tucked behind the Brera courtyard. Morning light spilled in through the high windows, catching dust in the air like floating glitter. Edoardo lounged on a paint-splattered chaise, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette he wasn't supposed to have indoors. Giulia laid her sketchbook on the table and opened it, revealing rough ideas. Portraits. Urban decay studies. Abstract concepts. Safe things. Edoardo didn't even glance. "No," he said flatly. "We're not doing another sad face in a corner piece." Giulia frowned. "It's a commentary on isolation in modern cities." He exhaled slowly. Too obvious. Too safe. He stood and walked to a covered canvas leaning against the wall. With a flourish, he whipped the cloth away. It wasn't a painting, it was a blueprint. A digital printout layered with notes and sketches in red ink. "We stage a crime scene," he said. Giulia blinked. "A what?" "A fake crime. In the central hall. Blood, broken glass, a sculpture smashed to bits. We leave clues. We make the entire school believe it really happened. Then we reveal it was art." She stared at him, stunned. "That's not a project. That's dangerous." Edoardo's eyes gleamed with thrill. Art should shake people. Wake them up. Make them question everything. She wanted to say no. Every nerve in her body screamed not to get involved. But something about his certainty, his charm, and his wild vision, it pulled her in. He stepped closer, voice low. "Come on, Giulia. Don't you want to be remembered?" Giulia didn't answer. But she didn't walk away either. And that silence was as good as a yes. Later that evening, Giulia found herself searching online for fake blood recipes. Flour. Corn syrup. Red dye. She shut the laptop and stared at the ceiling. This was not what she'd imagined when she applied to art school. But now she couldn't stop. She was in. And the line between art and crime had just started to blur. They met every night for the next week, always in secret. Their planning sessions took place in a forgotten storage room beneath the main building. The air smelled of mildew and turpentine, and the only light came from a flickering desk lamp Giulia had rescued from the trash. Each time they met, Edoardo brought something new: a cracked mannequin head, a broken picture frame, a tattered red scarf that would serve as a murder weapon. Giulia documented everything meticulously, sketching the layout of the hall, taking note of the camera angles, listing each item they would plant. She didn't want to admit it, but the work excited her. It felt like building a theater set, except the audience wouldn't know they were watching a play. Edoardo insisted on realism. The blood must splatter in a pattern that made sense. The broken glass had to match the fake window frame they would pretend had been shattered in the struggle. He even rehearsed how the sculpture would fall, using clay replicas to test the crack. They argued constantly. Julia wanted subtlety, layers of interpretation. Eduardo wanted spectacle. "We're not creating mystery, Julia," he said one night, leaning over the sketchbook. "We're detonating truth." "You don't detonate truth," she muttered. "You expose it." He laughed. "That's why we work. You give it poetry. I give it teeth." Despite everything, they grew closer. In between the tension, there were moments of strange calm, sharing coffee from paper cups, giggling over spilled paint, whispering secrets in the dark. On the sixth night, Eduardo reached for her hand without a word. She let him. That was the first time she felt something shift, not just in the project, but in her. She wasn't sure if it was pride, attraction, or fear. Maybe all three. Finally, after 8 days of obsessive planning, the scene was ready. It would take place on a Sunday night. The building would be empty, the alarms disabled just long enough for their performance. They would set up the crime scene in under 30 minutes, then vanish. When the students and professors arrived on Monday morning, the hall would greet them with chaos. Julia looked over the plan one final time and whispered, "We're not going to get caught." Eduardo grinned.
"No.
"We're going to get famous." But that night, as she lay awake in her small Milan apartment, listening to the distant hum of trams and motorbikes, Julia realized she had forgotten to plan one thing. What would happen when people believed it was real? Monday morning arrived like a blade sliding through still water. By 7, the Brera Academy was already humming. Professors shuffled in with coffees. Students rushed toward classes with sleep-heavy eyes and messy hair. No one expected what they would find in Gallery Room B. The scream came first. Then the silence. Then the chaos. Someone had called the carabinieri before the faculty even had a chance to react. Sirens pierced the usual Milanese calm. Officers stormed in, cordoning off the hall as if it were a real crime scene. The head of the department, Professor Mancini, looked pale and speechless. Students huddled together outside the tape, whispering wild theories. There was blood splattered across the floor in an arc that looked horrifyingly real. A cracked sculpture lay in fragments at the center, tangled with the red scarf, and the mannequin head had been carefully positioned beneath a broken window pane. No cameras had caught the perpetrators. That had been part of Julia's design. The hallway's only camera conveniently malfunctioned during the previous night. Julia stood among the onlookers, heart pounding. Her face was blank, almost bored, but her hands trembled slightly behind her coat pockets. She could feel Eduardo beside her, his eyes glinting with delight. He whispered, "Look at them. They believe it. Every single one." She didn't answer. It had worked. Too well. News outlets descended upon the academy like flies to honey. Within hours, hashtags trended online. Hashtag Brera murder. Hashtag art or crime. Hashtag who died in Gallery B. The dean issued a formal statement to the press, confirming no one had been hurt, but suspicion hung heavy. "We are cooperating with the authorities," he said, "and we are investigating every possible angle." Julia avoided going home that night. She wandered the streets of Milan instead, past the Duomo, through Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, her mind spinning. It had been just a project, a performance. But now the world was spinning a different story, one she could no longer control. When she finally returned to her flat, there was a message scrawled on her door. "I saw what you did." She stared at it, frozen. No signature. No explanation. She rubbed it off quickly with her sleeve, heart hammering in her chest. Had Eduardo done this? A joke? A warning? Or had someone else truly seen them? The performance had ended. But the consequences were only beginning. 2 days passed and no one suspected them. In fact, no one suspected anyone. The police remained baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no witnesses. The press speculated wildly. Some claimed it was a political statement. Others said it was a tragic hoax gone wrong. The students at Brera buzzed with theories. Some were terrified, others thrilled. A few even started bringing flowers to Gallery Room B, placing them beside the shattered sculpture as if mourning a real victim. Julia watched it all unfold with a sickening mix of pride and dread. Eduardo, on the other hand, seemed to bask in it. He walked the halls like a king returning from war, grinning at every headline, delighting in the confusion he had helped create. But something about his confidence unsettled Julia now. He spoke in riddles more often, always a little too loud, always one word away from revealing the truth. That Friday, Professor Mancini called a meeting with the sculpture students. "We will not tolerate this," he said firmly, pacing the studio. "If this is some kind of prank, it has crossed the line into criminal territory." His eyes scanned the room. For a moment, Julia thought they lingered on her. But he moved on. That night, Eduardo insisted they meet again in the storage room. Julia hesitated. Her instincts warned her, but she went anyway. He was already there, sitting on a crate, smoking a cigarette with one leg bouncing impatiently. "They're turning it into a shrine," he said, chuckling. "Can you believe it?" Julia didn't smile. "I think we should come clean," she said quietly. Eduardo turned to her slowly. His grin vanished. "No," he said. "We don't confess to art." "It's not art anymore," she replied. "It's a lie. A dangerous one." He stepped closer. "Is this about the message on your door?" he asked softly. Julia froze. "I didn't tell anyone about that." "I know," he said, voice calm. "I saw it too. I wiped it off after you left." He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not the only one being watched, Julia." The air felt colder. The room darker. "Someone knows," she whispered. "Maybe," Eduardo said, exhaling smoke. "Or maybe they're just playing our game better than we are." As she walked home that night, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the performance had spiraled out of their hands. And worse, someone else had taken control of the script. The tension at Brera thickened like smoke. Security had been increased. New cameras installed. All students were required to sign in and out, and the gallery was sealed off indefinitely. The art community outside the academy debated fiercely, was this conceptual genius or vandalism masquerading as creativity? Julia could barely sleep. Her dreams were fractured with crimson flashes, echoing footsteps, and that message. "I saw what you did." She began to notice things. People staring a little too long. Whispers cut short when she entered a room. And a shadow, always a few steps behind her when she walked alone. She tried to tell herself it was paranoia, stress, guilt. But the note slipped into her locker proved otherwise. It was a photograph. Grainy, taken from a distance. It showed her and Eduardo outside the academy, that night, dragging the sculpture's head in a sack. On the back was written, "Art is confession." She felt her breath vanish. Eduardo had to see this. But when she rushed to his flat, she found it dark and empty. No answer. His phone rang out and eventually went straight to voicemail. That night, she sat alone in her flat, staring at the photo. Every shadow outside her window felt like a figure. Every creak in the walls made her skin crawl. She didn't cry, she couldn't. The fear had dried her out. The next morning, a message arrived in her inbox. No sender. No subject. Just a single line in the body. "Meet me at the sculpture studio. Alone. Midnight." She almost deleted it. Almost. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, overruled fear. Midnight found her standing in the studio, surrounded by unfinished statues and tools that looked too much like weapons under the harsh light. The room was silent. Empty. Until the door creaked open. But it wasn't Eduardo. It was Alessio, a quiet, lanky second-year student, one she'd barely spoken to. He shut the door gently and looked at her with haunted eyes. "I know it was you," he said. Julia stepped back. "What do you want?" He held up another photo. It showed the sculpture scene in full, before the police ever arrived. "You weren't the first one there," he whispered. Julia stared, heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Alessio said, stepping closer, "that someone else staged something after you left." Alessio's photo changed everything. It clearly showed someone else, a third figure, returning to the scene after Julia and Eduardo had left. The silhouette was tall, genderless in the grainy black and white capture, and wore gloves. This figure didn't just observe. They moved pieces of the sculpture, deliberately rearranging the scene, placing the red paint with careful precision. They had built on the performance and made it worse. "I don't understand," Julia muttered, staring at the image. "Who would do this?" Alessio's face was pale. "I think whoever it was, they're not finished." He told her he had been at Brera late that night, working on a kinetic installation in the next building. He saw her and Eduardo leaving, caught their images on an old film camera he used for reference shots. "But something felt wrong," he said. "So I kept watching." When he returned an hour later, the figure was there, shifting the statue's remains, smearing the paint, setting the scene. It wasn't vandalism. It was calculated, surgical. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Julia demanded. Alessio hesitated. "I thought it was you two the whole time. I thought you were trying to make a statement. But after I saw that message on your locker door," he trailed off, then added, "You're being watched. Just like me." Julia's stomach twisted. If they weren't the only ones, then the stakes had changed completely. That night, she didn't sleep. She dug through all her correspondence with Eduardo, rereading old texts and voice notes. In one message from days before the incident, he mentioned someone he referred to only as the curator. At the time, she assumed it was a joke, part of his pretentious metaphors. But now she wondered, had Eduardo been in contact with someone else? Someone orchestrating this? The next day, Eduardo finally appeared. He looked different, thinner, with dark rings under his eyes, and a nervous energy she'd never seen before. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, trying to smile. "I might have," Julia replied. "We need to talk." They met in the sculpture garden, away from the eyes of security and cameras. Julia showed him the photo, watched his reaction.
He didn't blink.
"I told you," he said quietly. "Art invites chaos. We gave birth to something, Julia. We can't kill it now." "This isn't art anymore," she snapped. "It's a threat. Someone else is in control." Eduardo leaned closer. "You still don't get it," he whispered. Maybe we were never in control." The garden felt suddenly colder. As she walked away, Julia knew one thing for certain. Whatever had begun with their performance, it had become something else. And the third person, whoever they were, wasn't just watching. They were preparing for the next act. It began with whispers. In the weeks following the second crime, strange things began to happen inside the academy. Unlocked doors that no one remembered opening. Messages written in charcoal on easels. Installations moved ever so slightly overnight. And then there were the eyes. Julia could feel them, watching from behind sculptures, from the shadows of the high-vaulted ceilings. One morning, Julia arrived to find her sculpture smeared with something red. Not paint, a viscous, sticky red.
Blood.
A pigeon lay beside it, gutted and placed purposefully, like part of some grisly still life. She recoiled. Someone was escalating. Professor DeSantis held a closed-door meeting with several staff and security that afternoon. He insisted on discretion, afraid that publicizing any of this would damage the Academy's reputation. But Julia had seen it in his expression. He was afraid. The paranoia spread. Rumors fluttered through the halls like dead leaves. Some students blamed Julia and Eduardo. Others whispered that the Academy itself was cursed, that something had been awakened in the marble corridors, something older than performance art. Julia began investigating in secret. With Alessio's help, she traced the surveillance logs, looked into visitors from the night of the vandalism, and cross-referenced access records. One name kept appearing: Clara Bellini. She was an alumna of Brera, graduated 5 years ago, and had once been a rising star in Milan's avant-garde scene. Known for violent, visceral pieces that flirted with legality. But after a controversial performance involving a real knife and a staged sacrifice, she had vanished. Julia found an old photo of her in the archive. The hair was darker, but the eyes, intense, burning, were the same as the figure in Alessio's photo. "It's her," Julia breathed. "She's come back." Alessio hesitated. But why? What does she want? Revenge? Recognition? Or something else entirely? They discovered that Clara had once studied under Professor DeSantis and had been expelled just before graduation. The official reason: endangering others during a live piece. Now Julia understood the deeper pattern. This wasn't about Julia and Eduardo's work. It was a continuation, a twisted legacy. Clara had returned to finish what she had started, using their performance as the new canvas. Late one night, Julia found herself alone in the academy, checking the gallery space. As she turned a corner, the hallway lights flickered, and then cut out entirely. Silence. Then a faint sound. Scratching. She turned. At the end of the corridor, a figure stood, just within the reach of the emergency light. Long coat. Bare hands. No expression. Clara. Julia opened her mouth, but the woman vanished into the darkness. She ran, heart pounding. By the time security arrived, there was no one. No footprints. Just a note taped to the gallery door. It read, "The next piece will be the last." Julia knew it then. The final act was coming, and she had no idea who would survive it. Julia could feel the weight of the academy closing in. The eerie silence between classes was thick with dread. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps behind her. She refused to leave, even as the others grew uneasy, some even whispering about quitting. She knew that to stop Clara, she had to understand her. In the dusty archives beneath the academy, Julia uncovered old journals and letters from Clara's time there. The entries spoke of obsession, betrayal, and a desperate hunger to be seen, to break the boundaries of art, even if it meant crossing moral lines. One passage stood out. "They never understood me. They feared me. But my art will live on, reborn in fire and blood." Julia realized Clara's performance was not just about shock or revenge. It was about legacy, a dark masterpiece written in pain. On the night of the final performance, the academy was deserted except for a handful of students and staff who had stayed to help Julia. Cameras were set up to capture everything. The gallery space was transformed, walls covered in jagged black paint, shards of broken glass scattered on the floor, and a huge canvas blank and waiting. Hours passed with no sign of Clara. Then, suddenly, the doors slammed shut, locking everyone inside. The lights dimmed. From the shadows emerged a figure in black, moving with the grace of a predator. It was Clara. She began to paint on the canvas with furious strokes, her movements wild and raw, mixing colors with an intensity that felt almost supernatural. Julia watched, torn between horror and fascination. The painting took shape, a chaotic scene of torment and beauty intertwined. Then Clara stopped. She turned, her eyes blazing. "This is the truth," she said softly. "Art is not safe. It is a force that consumes." Suddenly, the canvas caught fire. Flames licked upwards, and smoke filled the room. Panic erupted as people scrambled for the exits. Julia grabbed Clara's arm. "Why?" Clara smiled sadly. "Because only in destruction can something new be born." The fire alarm screamed, sprinklers drenched the gallery. The blaze was contained, but the damage was done. Clara was gone. The next day, the academy was closed for repairs. Julia stood outside, looking at the charred remains of the gallery. She knew Clara's final act was a warning and a challenge. But what came next, Julia vowed, would be different. The days following the fire were filled with whispers and rumors. Milan's art world buzzed with speculation about what had truly happened inside the academy. Some said Clara had vanished forever, while others claimed she was still somewhere in the city, watching, waiting. Julia found herself at the center of attention. Some saw her as a hero who had tried to stop Clara. Others whispered that she was the one who had pushed the artist too far. But Julia knew the truth was more complicated. Clara was a brilliant but tortured soul, and the academy's rigid rules and jealous rivals had only made her darker. Determined to honor what she had learned, Julia vowed to change the academy. She wanted to create a space where art could be free, without fear or cruelty. Slowly, with the help of friends and supporters, She began rebuilding, not just the physical space, but the spirit of the place. New students arrived, inspired by the story and ready to create in their own ways. The academy opened its doors again, but with a new motto: art is life and life is art. Julia often thought of Clara, wondering where she was and if she had found peace. She hoped that somewhere the artist was still painting, but this time without pain. Milan moved on, but the legend of Clara and the burned gallery lived on, a haunting reminder of the thin line between genius and madness. For Julia, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where creativity and compassion could finally coexist.